Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into the Great Recoinage of 1696, the moment England tried to rebuild money itself and accidentally revealed how fragile a whole society becomes when trust inside the currency starts to crack, because in this story you are going to see how a tiny shave of silver can trigger national panic, how war and global trade can quietly drain a country's real money, and how a debate over something as boring sounding as coin standards turns into a moral argument about fairness, contracts, and power. So let's begin where every money story actually begins, not with banks, not with politicians, but with trust. In late 17th century England, everyday life runs on metallic money, especially silver, and that matters because silver is the money of ordinary exchange. It is what pays wages, buys bread, settles small debts, and keeps markets moving. And the key idea is that a coin is supposed to be a shortcut for trust, a little stamped promise that says, you don't need to test me, I'm what I claim to be. But once people stop believing that stamp, every payment becomes a mini investigation, every transaction becomes slower, and the economy starts to feel like it is moving through mud. Now add one more layer, because England is not isolated, it sits inside a wider world of bullion and trade, where silver and gold have market values that shift with international demand, and England also lives with the constant tension of having both metals in play, meaning there is always a temptation for people to treat coins not as money to spend, but as metal to profit from. And here's the subtle but crucial point: a monetary system can look stable on paper while being unstable in practice if it creates easy arbitrage. Because if the market price of silver rises relative to what the mint effectively treats it as, then suddenly a coin is worth more as melted metal than as money. So good coin does not circulate, it exits, it disappears into hoards, melting pots, or ships bound for foreign markets, and the people left behind are the last ones holding the most suspicious pieces. So when we say the currency is built on trust, we mean something very literal. That trust is what allows the coin to circulate at face value instead of being weighed and argued over every time it changes hands. And once that trust breaks, you do not just get bad money, you get a society where trade becomes friction, where prices become confusing, and where the strongest actors, the ones with the best information, the best scales, and the most leverage, start to win the game by default, which should make you wonder. If a country's money is supposed to be the most reliable measuring stick in daily life, what happens when the measuring stick itself starts shrinking while everyone pretends it is the same length? Now here's where the story turns from abstract to almost painfully physical, because the crisis does not begin with a grand speech, it begins with fingers and knives and tiny slivers of stolen silver. Much of England's circulating silver at this time is older hammered coin, and hammered coin has a problem that is almost embarrassingly simple: its edges are irregular, its shape is not perfectly uniform, and that makes it easier to shave without it looking obviously tampered with. So clipping spreads like a quiet epidemic, one coin at a time, and the genius of this crime is that it hides inside normal life, because a clipped coin can still pass in a hurry, in dim light, in a crowded market, especially if everyone is desperate to keep commerce moving. And what makes it even worse is that once clipping becomes common, ordinary people have to spend time and attention proving what should have been obvious. And the cost of that time is not evenly distributed, because who has the leisure to weigh every coin and argue with every customer? The wealthy merchant, or the small shopkeeper trying to survive on narrow margins, the worker trying to buy food before the day ends, the widow paying rent, the farmer at market, the people whose transactions are small but constant. This is why clipping acts like a hidden tax, because the loss of silver content does not vanish into the air, it is transferred. And it keeps transferring until someone finally gets stuck with the underweight coin. And guess who is least able to refuse payment and start a confrontation? Usually the person with the least power in the transaction. And then we hit the key incentive failure that takes this from a crime problem to system problem. Because if low-weight coin is still accepted by the state at face value for taxes, then the state unintentionally creates a privileged exit route for bad coin. It is like declaring, we will treat the worst coins as equal to the best coins, at least when they come back to us, and that warps behavior across the whole country, because rational people then want to spend the best coins elsewhere or melt them, while the degraded coins are pushed through the channels where they will be accepted without question, and suddenly the honest citizen is punished for being careful, while the person passing bad coin gains an advantage for being reckless or ruthless. And this is where you can feel the moral pressure building, because money is not just metal, it is a social agreement, and clipping is an attack on that agreement. But the deeper attack is when the rules of acceptance reward the attacker, because then the system itself becomes an accomplice, and you start to get a world where good coin quietly disappears, bad coin circulates more aggressively, and people begin to treat every payment as a potential trap, which raises a question that seems small but is actually enormous. What happens to a society when honesty becomes a disadvantage at the cash register? Alright, now widen the lens, because clipping is not happening in a vacuum, it is colliding with war, trade, and the cold logic of international markets, and that collision is what turns a monetary sickness into a full-blown national crisis. England is fighting the 9 Years' War, which means the government needs more resources, more revenue, more payments moving through the system. At the exact moment the quality of the money itself is failing, and war does something very specific to an economy. It increases fiscal pressure while also increasing uncertainty, and that combination makes people cling to whatever feels most reliable. Meanwhile, silver and gold are not just English money, they are internationally traded commodities, and when the market value of silver rises relative to the terms England is effectively using at the mint, something predictable happens. Coins stop behaving like neutral tools of exchange and start behaving like profit opportunities, because if a silver coin contains metal worth more than its official face value, then melting it or exporting it becomes the rational move, not because people are evil, but because the system is offering them a reward for doing it. And now notice the cruel irony: the better the coin, the more it is worth as bullion, so the best money is precisely what gets pulled out of circulation first, leaving behind the worst, and the moment that starts happening at scale, daily life breaks in a very particular way, not with one dramatic collapse, but with a shortage of small change, because you cannot buy bread with a gold piece. You cannot pay a day labour easily with a large coin, you cannot run a bustling market on awkward denominations, so what begins as silver leaving the country becomes ordinary exchange becoming impossible, and as silver drains away, gold coins become more common in circulation, but that is not a clean solution. It is like replacing pennies with $100 bills and then acting surprised that everything becomes harder, because the currency is not only about wealth, it is about divisibility, liquidity, and convenience, and when small silver vanishes, the system loses its ability to make fine-grained payments, which hits the lower and middle levels of society first and hardest, and in the background, trade routes, bullion dealers, and international demand keep pulling at England's coin supply like gravity, meaning the crisis is not just domestic misbehavior, it is a structural tension between a national money standard and a global bullion market, and once that tension becomes severe, people start to ask a frightening question: if the money we rely on can simply be sucked away by incentives and international prices, then what, exactly, is holding the economy together besides habit and hope? Now we arrive at one of my favorite parts of this whole episode, because it is a reminder that monetary crises are never only technical, they are philosophical and moral, and in 1696 the fight is basically this: what is money, really, and what do we owe to the past when the present is on fire? On one side you have William Lowndes, looking at the ugly reality of melted and exported coin and saying, in essence, we have to change the extrinsic value, meaning we adjust the official value so coins align better with market conditions, because if you do not, the best coins will keep vanishing, and circulation will not recover, and he is trying to stop the bleeding by changing the terms of the game so the metal inside a coin is not worth more than the coin itself. But then you have John Locke, who reacts like someone hearing a proposal to change the measuring units in the middle of construction, and he says no, do not raise the value of money by decree, because money is supposed to be anchored in its intrinsic content, and if you start redefining value politically, you destabilize contracts, wages, rents, and every long-term agreement that was made in good faith. So the question becomes, do you fix circulation by changing the unit of account, or do you preserve the unit of account even if it causes pain in the short run? And then, hovering between these positions, you have Isaac Newton, who is not just a scientist playing with coins, he is also a practical administrator concerned with how people will behave, how markets will respond, and what the consequences will be for fairness and public order. And Newton's thinking leans toward respecting market realities while warning about who gets crushed when policy moves too quickly or too bluntly, because even if you are right in theory, you can still be reckless in execution. So the debate is not just a devalue or do not devalue. It is about trust in public promises, it is about whether the state can adjust value without violating people's expectations, and it is about distribution, because any change in the value of money will create winners and losers, and the losers are often the people with fixed incomes, fixed debts, or the weakest bargaining power. And here's the dramatic punchline of this slide: if you have ever wondered why people become emotional about monetary policy, it is because money sits at the intersection of arithmetic and morality. It is the tool we use to measure effort, repay obligations, and store the meaning of past work. So when Lowndes and Locke argue they are not just arguing about coin. They are arguing about what kind of society you are allowed to build when the ground beneath trade is shifting, and the question hangs there like a dare. You can rewrite the value of money to solve today's emergency. What stops tomorrow's politicians from rewriting it again when it benefits them? So after all that debate, Parliament has to choose, because ideas are nice, but markets do not pause politely while philosophers finish their essays, and in January of 1696 the decision lands on a dramatic solution: full recoinage, meaning the old silver is to be called in, melted down, and reissued to the old Elizabethan standard, and that choice tells you what they valued most in that moment. Because instead of officially redefining money upward to match the battered reality of circulation, they chose to restore the coin itself back to what it was supposed to be, which is basically a national attempt to say, we are not changing the meaning of the contract, we are repairing the instrument, but notice the trade-off, because this is not a gentle tune-up, it is a massive replacement of the very objects people use to trade, save, and pay taxes. So the state is effectively betting that restoring integrity in the long run is worth the disruption in the short run, and that is a risky bet when your entire economy depends on people being able to transact tomorrow morning, not just in theory next year. And the heart of the policy is a set of deadlines and legal definitions, because you can declare what counts as good money, and you can set dates after which bad coin loses its status as legal tender, but those declarations are only as strong as the system's ability to replace what it is removing. So the practical question becomes, can you pull defective money out of circulation fast enough without causing commerce to seize up before the new money arrives? And there is also a deeper ethical question embedded in the choice to keep the old standard. Because it sounds like stability, it sounds like protecting trust, and in many ways it is, but it also means the transition costs are not avoided, they are merely relocated into the process, because someone has to bear the pain of the gap between what the law says money should be and what people actually have in their pockets right now, and this is where policy gets real, because preserving nominal contract terms is not just an abstract principle, it is a decision that impacts wages, rents, debts, and the daily ability to buy food, and the timing matters. Because the market does not care that Parliament has good intentions, the market cares whether you can pay an acceptable coin at the end of the day. So this slide is the moment the country steps onto the tightrope, choosing a route that aims to rebuild trust by restoring the currency substance, while risking a very dangerous transitional shock, and you can almost hear the tension in the air. Because once you announce a full recoinage, you are not just fixing coins, you are testing whether law can reassemble trust faster than fear can spread. Alright, let's get wonderfully mechanical for a second, because the great recoinage is not just a policy idea, it is a physical operation on the bloodstream of the economy, and it hinges on a deceptively simple upgrade, the move toward milled, machine-made coins with cleaner uniform shapes and, crucially, edges designed to make clipping harder and more obvious, which is basically the state saying, if you're going to steal silver, we're going to make you work for it, and we're going to make it visible, and that technical detail matters because it is an attempt to rebuild trust through design, not just through punishment. But here's the catch, you can have the best coin design in the world and still fail if you cannot actually produce enough coins fast enough, and the mint faces a brutal capacity problem, because replacing the money supply is not like replacing a few broken pipes. It is like rebuilding the entire plumbing system while everyone is still trying to shower, cook, and flush the toilet at the same time, so the solution becomes surprisingly creative: country mints, meaning additional minting sites beyond London, which creates something like a semi-decentralized production network where coin is still governed by central rules and standards, but the physical work is spread out across multiple locations to increase throughput, and when you see the scale, it stops feeling like a quaint old story and starts feeling like industrial mobilization. Because during the recoinage, about £6.8 million worth of silver gets coined, and roughly a quarter of that comes from these country mints, which is enormous for the era and tells you how urgent the situation is, and you can almost picture it as a national logistics problem: old coin and silver being gathered, assayed, melted, struck, and redistributed, with routes to and from minting centers, and with constant risk at every step, from bottlenecks to fraud to simple human error. And this slide is basically the behind-the-scenes revelation that monetary policy is never only theory, it is capacity, infrastructure, and execution, because the state can promise a new trustworthy currency, but it still has to literally manufacture trust into metal, one stamped disc at a time, at a pace fast enough to keep commerce alive. And now we hit the moment where well-intended repair turns into a sudden economic chokehold, because the recoinage does not just replace bad money with good money, it also removes a huge share of the circulating medium before the replacement arrives, and that sequencing creates what we can call, very plainly, a liquidity shock. The law sets hard dates after which clipped coin is no longer accepted as legal tender. And that sounds reasonable, like finally closing the door on fraud, but the trap is timing, because if you lock the door before the new house is built, everyone is suddenly standing outside in the rain, and according to the account we're drawing on, by the time demonetization bites, only a small fraction of the needed new silver has been minted, which means people panic for real money, the kind of money that will still be accepted tomorrow, so the best coins are hoarded. The new coins are immediately swallowed up by those who can get them, and the effective money supply contract right when the economy needs liquidity to keep making payments, which is like draining oil out of an engine while it is still running and then acting surprised when it seizes, and when the monetary base contracts sharply, the first thing that collapses is not long-term investment, it is ordinary exchange, because wages cannot be paid smoothly, small purchases become awkward, debts become harder to settle, and every person starts thinking one step ahead, not what is fair, but what will be accepted. And that shift in mindset spreads fast because it is rational fear, and rational fear is contagious. And here's the nasty part, once people begin demanding only the most trustworthy forms of money, anything slightly questionable gets pushed away, so the burden lands on the edges of society, on people who cannot easily refuse payment, on markets where bargaining power is thin, and on communities far from the centers where new coin is arriving, and that is why this slide matters so much. Because it shows how a legal declaration can instantly change behavior and shrink liquidity, not through a grand conspiracy, but through incentives and survival logic, and it leaves us with a question that should make any serious student of history uneasy. If your economy runs on exchange, what happens when the very medium of exchange is pulled out faster than it can be replaced? When money gets scarce and confidence gets shaky, people do what humans have always done in a crisis, they run toward what feels solid, and in 1696 that means specie, actual coin, and this is where we see a classic bank-run dynamic emerge. Depositors rush to convert claims into metal, and the Bank of England, still a relatively young institution in the grand timeline of history, faces a brutal reality that every bank eventually has to face. It cannot instantly turn every promise into coin at the same time, because banking works on timing, not magic, so under intense pressure the bank is forced to suspend or delay payments during the peak, and that is not just a financial event, it is a psychological event, because the moment people suspect the door might close, they sprint. Now, society does not become completely mute just because silver is scarce, people improvise, and liquidity substitutes expand. Things like credit arrangements, book accounts, and informal networks of trust, and those can keep trade alive. But here is the unfairness built into the substitute system. Access is uneven, because credit is not distributed like rain, it is distributed like reputation, connections, and leverage, so the merchant with a long history and a web of partners can keep trading, while the wage earner and the small market seller still need something that settles immediately, something universally accepted. So the crisis creates a hierarchy of liquidity where the same shortage produces very different outcomes depending on who you are. And that leads to the moral question embedded in this slide, and I want you to actually sit with it for a beat, because it is not just academic. Who gets liquidity first when the foundation of legal tender is being rebuilt? Who gets to keep moving while others are forced to stop? Who can swap paper claims for coin? And who has to accept delay, discount, or outright refusal? And this is why bank runs are so historically fascinating, because they reveal what is normally hidden, the quiet dependence of everyday stability on confidence, coordination, and the belief that promises will be honored on demand. And once that belief starts wobbling, the whole structure begins to creak loud enough for everyone to hear. Now we watch the consequences spill out of the mint and into real streets and real households, because the second half of 1696 is not remembered as a neat technical correction, it is remembered for unemployment, poverty, and unrest, and that connection is not mysterious once you understand the mechanism. If the money supply contracts sharply and payments become disrupted, employers struggle to pay workers, merchants struggle to restock, and ordinary exchange slows down, so the economic machine that normally turns effort into income starts skipping and stalling, and people who live closest to the margin feel it first. And what makes this episode so instructive is the lesson about the difference between a unit of account and a medium of exchange, because you can insist that the pound still means the same thing on paper, but if the physical means to settle transactions are missing, then the measurement does not help you much. It is like having a ruler with perfect markings while the bridge you need to cross is out, so the measurement exists but the movement does not, and when the state sets centralized deadlines without matching capacity, it transforms a repair into a shock, and the shock is not evenly distributed. It concentrates where liquidity is most necessary and bargaining power is weakest, which is why social strain appears alongside the policy timeline. Because economic systems are not just charts, they are people trying to pay rent and buy food and keep dignity intact, and the cause and effect chain becomes painfully clear. Clipping erodes trust, the recoinage law tries to restore integrity, the removal of old coin outpaces the arrival of new coin, commerce slows, livelihoods break, and then unrest follows, not because people suddenly became irrational, but because when exchange collapses, so does the thin layer of stability that makes daily life feel predictable. And this slide should leave you with a humbling takeaway, that the most dangerous policy failures are often not about bad goals, but about sequencing, incentives, and the refusal to ask, in advance, who will bear the cost while the system is being fixed. So, with silver in chaos and everyone scrambling for whatever will actually function as money tomorrow, gold steps into the spotlight, and this is where the story gives us a wonderfully revealing policy move. An act in 1696 sets a maximum value for the guinea at 22 shillings, which is basically the government saying, we are going to put a ceiling on what this gold coin can be treated as worth in everyday exchange. And the reason is understandable, because when people lose confidence in one part of the monetary system, they rush into another, and if gold's value in terms of silver is swinging wildly, pricing and payment become even more confusing, so the cap is meant to create stability during turbulence. But here is the trap that this slide wants you to see: once a state fixes prices between different forms of money, it is stepping onto a treadmill. Because the market ratio between gold and silver does not freeze just because a statute says so, it keeps moving with supply, demand, and international bullion flows. So the moment the legal cap drifts away from the market reality, incentives appear, and those incentives have sharp teeth, because people will hoard, underpay, overpay, melt, export, or reroute coins in whatever way the new legal mispricing rewards. And you do not even need cynicism to understand this, you just need to imagine yourself as a merchant trying to survive. If the law says a guinea is worth no more than 22 shillings, but the market suggests it should be higher, do you happily accept the loss out of patriotic virtue? Or do you adjust your behavior to avoid being the person who gets exploited by the mismatch? So the cap becomes a perfect example of a recurring historical pattern. Interventions that try to stabilize money relationships often create a new edge for arbitrage, enforcement burdens, and unintended distributional effects. And the interesting question this slide invites is not a sermon, it is a real inquiry. Did the cap reduce chaos by giving people a clear reference point, or did it quietly create new distortions by forcing an artificial price between two monies whose relationship was being shaped by global markets and panic behavior? Because when you fix the price of something that is moving, you are not stopping motion, you are redirecting it into hidden channels, and history loves to show us where those channels lead. Now let's step back and look at what lingers after the smoke of crisis clears, because the great recoinage is not just a short-term drama, it changes the texture of the system going forward. On the most straightforward level, the recoinage improves coin quality, the new milled silver is harder to clip and easier to recognize, so the basic integrity of the money object is strengthened. And that matters because a society cannot function smoothly if every payment feels like a gamble. But the deeper pressures do not magically disappear, because the pull of international bullion markets and the persistent tensions of using both silver and gold continue to shape what actually circulates. And over the early 1800s, the practical direction is toward a more gold-centered system, not necessarily by a single announcement but by repeated pressures and responses that keep pushing behavior in that direction. And here's the overlooked truth that this slide wants you to hold in your mind: metal alone does not create trust. Institutions and habits do, because people accept money because they expect others to accept it, and because they believe the rules around it will be reliable enough to plan their lives. But when the metal fails, when coin quality collapses or coin supply vanishes, it exposes institutional fragility immediately, like an X-ray, showing you which promises are sturdy and which ones were held together by confidence and routine. And at the same time, the episode accelerates reliance on financial instruments beyond coin, because society cannot simply stop trading while the mint catches up, so paper claims, credit arrangements, and other substitutes become more important, not as a conspiracy but as an adaptive response, a way of building bridges when the official road is under construction. And that adaptation changes the future, because once people get used to transacting with claims and instruments, the monetary system becomes layered, metal at the base, paper and credit on top, and the real question becomes not only how much silver is in the coin, but how trustworthy is the network of promises built above it. So the long arc after 1696 is this fascinating mix of restored physical money and expanded abstract money, better coin integrity alongside deeper dependence on institutions, and it should make you pause and ask, when a society rebuilds money after a breakdown, does it simply return to the old world, or does it quietly create the foundations of a new one? So here we are at the reflective end of the journey, and I want to treat this slide like a set of lenses you can keep for the rest of your life, because the Great Recoinage is ultimately a case study in incentives, capacity, and ethics, not just coins. First, the incentives lesson: accepting degraded coin for taxes created a predictable selection effect. Because when the state treats the worst coins as equal to the best within a privileged channel, it quietly encourages people to route bad money toward that channel and protect good money for themselves. And in a world of uncertainty, even decent people respond to those incentives, which means that rules meant to simplify payment can accidentally reward the very behavior that corrodes trust. Second, the governance lesson: centralized fixes can look perfect on paper while failing in sequencing, capacity, and distribution, because passing a law is not the same thing as ensuring a society can function while that law is implemented. And if the deadlines outrun the infrastructure, the transition itself becomes a shock that damages the people who have the least flexibility. And third, the moral lens, because repairing a unit of account is not just a technical operation, it is a decision about who bears cost, who gets access to liquidity first, and what happens to ordinary life while the system is being rebuilt. So it is worth asking the hard questions out loud. What is a just way to repair a broken measuring stick when millions of contracts and wages and rents depend on it? And when does protecting trust become the justification for imposing pain on those least able to absorb it? And I also want to nod toward decentralized alternatives without pretending they are utopia, because voluntary credit networks, reputation systems, and competitive instruments can add resilience and flexibility when official money is scarce. But they also concentrate power if entry is closed and if only certain people get access. So the real lesson is not that one structure is pure and the other is evil. The lesson is that every system has incentive paths, and history punishes the systems that pretend incentives do not exist. And if you enjoyed this kind of thoughtful, entertaining history where we take an event that sounds obscure and discover that it explains the mechanics of trust, power, and everyday life, please like, comment, and subscribe to Truth Behind History, and tell me in the comments, if you were Parliament in 1696, would you prioritize restoring the coin's integrity even if it risked a short-term freeze, or would you adjust the declared value to match the market and accept the moral cost that comes with rewriting the measuring stick? And if you want more stories like this, explore the channel for deeper dives into the moments when systems break, and what those breaks reveal about how societies really work.